Gagliardi, who some of you will know, but you will probably know Anna, and some of you will not. Anna is a scientist upstairs on the 13th floor. She is a professor at the University of Toronto, senior scientist, has been super successful of late, winning gigantic HSRF awards and THGHRI awards in the last competition, so she's on a meteoric rise. I don't think any of it has to do with medical devices. That's all in the future. Yeah. But very successful, and just your neighbor upstairs, so we're looking forward to hearing about medical devices. Anna.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Murray. It doesn't feel so meteoric on a day-to-day basis when you're just logging through the day-to-day stuff. So thanks for coming to the presentation on the Friday before a long weekend and before university spring break, and welcome to those who are joining remotely. I thought I would start with just a brief overview of the kind of research that I do. As Murray said, some of you don't know me, and so I thought I'd just introduce the kind of research that I do. I'm an implementation scientist, and quite a bit of my research focuses on guideline implementation and guideline implementability. So how can we make those types of knowledge syntheses more useful to the users? How can we design them in terms of content and format so that they're more likely to be used by the end users? More recently, my research is also focused on patient engagement or patient-centered care, and as Murray said, I've been very lucky to have recently acquired 2 grants that will allow us to study patient-centered care or patient engagement at the organizational level, so patients assisting with planning, evaluating, and improving the quality of healthcare, but also at the individual patient level. So how can we make that interaction and that experience for the individual patient better? Much of my research involves systematic reviews, qualitative research, consensus techniques, but I've also done studies of a mixed methods nature, so that includes quantitative analysis of data extracted from medical records combined with qualitative research. The study I'm going to talk about today is not a mixed method study, it's what we might call a multi-method study, because it has multiple components using different research designs. Before I talk about the medical devices study, I wanted to recognize the members of the research team, which you can see listed here, including people from Toronto as well as across Canada. Here are the learning objectives for today's presentation, and there's many because I'm going to present an overview of the entire study, and although there were 3 components to the study, there were a number of different issues that we addressed that ended up being reported in different publications. I'll let you just look at that for a moment. Ultimately, we shared our findings with people from across Canada. I'm going to show to you what we discussed with them, and then maybe at the end of this presentation open it up for some discussion about your thoughts and perspectives on what are the logical or warranted next steps based on our findings. So medical devices are defined as non-drug technologies or instruments vital to the prevention, diagnosis, cure, or treatment of a disease or abnormal physical condition. In Canada, they are classified in 4 different categories. So many things probably that we don't necessarily think of as medical devices are classified in one of these categories. So for example, things like crutches or hospital beds or wheelchairs are classified as the lowest risk of medical devices. Class 2 includes things like different types of scopes. Class 3 are considered moderate risk devices, and that includes implantable knees and hips. And Class 4 are those of a higher risk because they are more of an invasive nature, and so that includes various types of cardiovascular devices. And many, many, many more devices fall within these 4 categories. The reason we became interested in medical devices is because the devices themselves are one of the top cause or leads to one of the top 3 patient safety incidents in hospitals. And here we're not talking about the way they're used by the individual clinician. We're talking about problems caused by the device itself. And that may be related to device design, but may be also related to the way the device is delivered or packaged or the instructions that come with the device. But we're really talking about problems that are caused as a result of the device or the way it arrives or is used. We started working on this series of studies probably as far back as 2008. We were talking about medical devices and what we might want to investigate. And we started out with a THGHRI planning grant, so that's a small amount of money that you can get to bring people together of different specialties, talk about an issue or a problem, and generate a research agenda. So at that time, we did qualitative interviews with 37 different people from Canada and the United States, including people, for example, from the FDA in the United States, which regulates medical devices. And then we held a meeting, including Canadian and American people, clinicians, researchers, policymakers, regulatory people. So 47 people came to our meeting. The purpose of the meeting was really to talk about, given that devices cause problems, how can we better identify those problems and then prevent them in additional patients? So what sort of systems are in place now, or what sort of systems do we need to put in place to better monitor what we call adverse medical device events? So we also did a background literature review, shared all of this information with the stakeholders, and as it turns out, they could recommend no single or multifaceted strategy that would be a single or best solution to monitoring for adverse medical device events. Instead, what they suggested to us is that we really needed to do much more exploratory research to better describe the problems faced by clinicians or patients in order to be able to better identify what types of interventions might be needed at either the pre-market stage or the post-market stage. So the findings of that work, that very exploratory consultation with stakeholders, was published in 2013, I think, in BMJ Quality and Safety. So on the advice of the people we consulted with, we acquired funding from THGHRI for a 3-year operating grant. And as I said, it was a multiple method study where we wanted to describe what evidence is available to help hospitals, individual clinicians make decisions about which of many devices available to them they should use in a given patient. We wanted to describe the number of devices recalled because of problems in Canada to be able to better describe the nature, the magnitude of the problem, and if it really is an issue of risk that should be addressed in some manner. And we wanted to describe factors that influence how hospitals or individuals make decisions about which devices to use, and if and how adverse medical device events are reported. So the first component involves studying the evidence available to support decision-making. And the publication that came out of this study was published in PLOS ONE. This is in 2016. All of the other publications that I'll be showing you or discussing were published in 2017. We did a systematic review of studies that evaluated knee implants. Not because we chose knee implants because it's a very prevalent procedure. We chose knee implants because it's an effective procedure for correcting knee problems. So we were not attempting to examine clinical effectiveness. We wanted to describe quality of the evidence that an individual clinician or a hospital would have access to if they were trying to decide whether one knee implant was better than another knee implant. So what kind of performance data is available to guide decision-making for medical devices? We had trouble finding this literature, and so what we did is we did a review of reviews. So we identified all types of systematic reviews, health technology assessments, using literature databases, also doing search of 2 health technology assessment journals. But then from all of those reviews, we actually acquired all the primary studies. So 265 studies evaluating knee implants. They were published between 1986 to 2014, so a big span of years, and in total involving nearly 60,000 patients. We were assessing the nature of the studies on the different types of knee implants, and there are many different types of devices generated by different, or produced by different companies. So we found that many of those devices were evaluated in only one study. They were largely single cohort, so not comparative research, involving less than 100 patients and less than 2 years follow-up. So, for example, in comparison with drug evaluations, drugs undergoing really rigorous evaluation over many years and randomized controlled trials, we really don't have that kind of evidence available for medical devices. So our conclusions, and those of others who have done similar studies for different types of medical devices, like cardiovascular devices, have also found that people who would be making decisions about medical devices are really relying on poor quality evidence to inform their choices. Another study that we did was to describe recalls of medical devices in Canada. So this was published in the International Journal of Health Technology Assessment in 2017. We acquired data from Health Canada, so they were one of our research partners on our THR grant, and were very generous in providing us with 10 years of data that they had collected on medical device recalls. That was supplemented with data that's publicly available, but that we had to sort of painstakingly collect through these online databases and then blend and then clean so that we had a data set to work with. And so online, you can find the Medical Devices Act as license listing, which is a repository of medical devices licensed in Canada, and the Recall and Safety Alerts database, which is not just for devices, it's also for consumer products, motor vehicles, but also includes medical devices. So analysis of that data set showed that almost 25,000 new devices were licensed between 2005 and 2015, that 10-year time span. Among those devices, there were 7,226 recalls, and 5% of those recalls were judged to be priority 1 recalls. That means they were judged to have a reasonable probability of serious consequences or death. So 5% over 10 years may not sound like a lot, but these are pretty profound consequences for those patients. The other thing I'll draw your attention to is the percent of priority 2 recalls. So the priority 1 recalls included a variety of types of devices, not only those that are classified as the higher risk category, but it did include cardiovascular devices, for example. The priority 2 classification of risk is for those that cause temporary adverse outcomes for patients. And 60% of those recalls were class 2, and that included things like hips and knees. Yeah.
So each one of these is a device being recalled, not an instance of a patient having a device. And these are
device recalls.
Do you have any sense of how many patients would be affected by the serious versus the temporary devices?
No, it's not something our study looked at. That would be really difficult to determine. I may come to it in the rest of the presentation, but you know, one of the clinicians we spoke with said when a device recall occurs, and we need to figure out which of our patients has that device, so we can alert them or bring them back in for assessment or for to take it out and give them a new one. It's really difficult to do because many hospitals don't keep a database of the device ID. Like, it's not automated. So they told us it's really time consuming. They have to go book through books and books and books, where they have stickers that were taken off the device, and they have to backtrack manually through those books to figure out which patient got which device. So it's not something that we've calculated, or I don't think I've seen it in any other literature. Mhm.
So of the recalls, does that include only the incident devices between 2005 and 2015, or is that among the all prevalent devices in Canada? Because I mean, if it's an incident, that's like a third of all devices getting recalled. Does that sound right?
So those were recalled, but what I should explain is that a recall does not mean that a device is necessarily taken off the market. So a recall could be removed from use, but a recall also means a warning.
Even so, like, no matter what it is, like a third of all devices, is that correct, or is it 7,000 out of some much larger denominator?
So among that body of almost 25,000 new devices, there were 7,226 recalls.
That's a big number.
Really, the purpose of our study, even though this is a quantitative method, it's very exploratory in nature because it's revealing a number of issues that really warrant further exploration. So I've talked about two components of the study already. One of the components being that review of evidence, of the nature of the evidence for knee implants. The second part of it was describing how many devices are recalled and how many of those are potentially serious recalls, recalls related to devices that have serious consequences for patients. The other part of the study was a qualitative study. So I did interviews with 22 physicians who implanted devices. They came from across Canada, represented different stages of their career, and not the cardiovascular people were academic, but for the orthopedic people I spoke to, they were from both community and academic settings. So 10 cardiovascular physicians, and you can see here on the slide, types of devices that they implanted, and 12 orthopedic clinicians, and here's the types, and you can see here the types of devices that they implanted. So a variety of different devices were what they were speaking to. Now, from that same set of data, those of you who are quantitative people might be laughing that I only gathered information from 22 people, but that's pretty typical for a qualitative study. But this was a fascinating study to do because the people we spoke with were quite forthcoming, and we asked them a number of different questions. And then we analyzed that same set of data, but from a number of different perspectives, which led to several unique publications on different issues. So same data set, but we examined what they told us about different issues from a variety of perspectives. So one of those was, how do you decide from amongst the array of devices that might be available on the market what you're going to use in an individual patient? And the study was just published in BMC Medical Informatics and Decision Making. So here's a figure from the study. The first thing that this may suggest to you is that decision-making is kind of cognitively complex and challenging because there's so many factors that the individual clinician needs to consider in making that decision about what type of device to use. So I'll kind of work my way around this figure. If we start with the physician factors, one of the key issues that influences what type of device physicians use is what they were trained with. The reason there's an possible implication for that is that if they don't have that device available to them, then they might not be quite so proficient on the device that their hospital uses. It also means that if a different kind of device might actually be better for the patient, they might not be comfortable using it. So unless they refer the patient to a different physician who uses that device that might be better for the patient. So they're working within the constraints of potentially their own proficiency with different types of devices. They also rely a lot, given the lack of good data on the performance of different devices, they rely a lot on colleagues. There's a lot of informal discussion that happens amongst clinicians about to share their experiences with different devices to try and figure out if one is better than another or what are the problems associated with a given device that I need to be aware of. But they also get a lot of information from device reps, so the representatives from the manufacturers. And they do recognize that sometimes that information may not be reliable. because we heard them say things like, my device rep didn't tell me that there was a problem, and we had to read it when there was a publication in some journal that this particular type of device was causing a problem. So they need to be quite vigilant in themselves investigating the benefits or the merits of different types of devices. We're going to talk about patient engagement and decision-making, but physicians that we interviewed told us that they definitely have to consider various patient factors when they're making their decision about which type of device to use that might be best for the patient, given various patient characteristics. I'll come back to that. We've already talked about the fact that there's really a lack of evidence to give them performance data on which type of device might be better to use than another. In terms of health system issues, they told us that sometimes their hospital might be out of stock of the type of device they want to use, in which case they would have to use whatever was available. They also talked about purchasing contracts. So sometimes purchasing contracts are established at the hospital level, sometimes they're established at the regional level, sometimes they're established at the provincial level. So the government might make an agreement with a particular manufacturer of a particular type of device that's the device that everyone will use. I have a couple of quotes to share with you about that. So that kind of constrains choice that a physician might make about a device that might be, in fact, better for the patient, but they're required to use the devices specified in their hospitals or the regions or their provinces purchasing contracts. They might also be limited by the market. So, for example, for cardiovascular devices, there might be less choice for a particular type of device versus orthopedic devices where there's lots and lots and lots to choose from. So if one device they found was not performing very well, they might have the option to choose a different type of device or the similar device but by a different company unless there were restrictions based on purchasing contracts for which type of devices they could use. So a lot of issues happening. So here I've shared a quote with you that I quite like. I know it's long, but it has a lot of really interesting stuff in it. So rather than me reading it to you, I'll give you just a moment to read that. So essentially what they're saying is that given that the devices undergo really little evaluation before they're marketed and used in patients, what's really happening is that essentially clinical trials are happening, but in patients. Outside of clinical trials, we're talking about just day-to-day practice. Here's some more interesting quotes. Sometimes the implant you put in is not what you think is best for the patient because that's the only thing available through the buying group or the purchasing contract. One of the biggest deciding factors will be cost, not necessarily surgeon comfort, so competence with a particular device, patient anatomy, or track record of the implant. We've had experience that if you force surgeons to change implants based on a contract, so that refers to the purchasing agreement, that your complication rate goes up for a while. That's problematic. So it might make good business sense, but then you actually go and look at your revision costs over the next month to 2 years, and then all of a sudden all your cost savings went into the pain and suffering of patients and their subsequent care. So there's really profound implications for patients for sure, but also for the health system. Now, I said I would come back to the issue of engaging patients in discussions and decisions about which device they will get. Just in general, patient engagement is a big deal. I think it always has been really. The original definition of evidence-based medicine meant decisions were made based on evidence, based on clinical judgment, and also patient and family preferences. So it's not like patient engagement or patient-centered care is a new thing, but there's really a big emphasis on this now. And so in the course of our interviews, we asked clinicians that we spoke with, as part of your decision-making process, do you inform patients about the potential risks and the uncertain outcomes associated with the device they're going to get? And are they involved in those discussions, and does that influence decision-making? So here's some of the quotes, and you can see there were a few differences of opinion, but really the sentiment expressed in the first quote was in the minority. I think there might have been 2 people who said really patients should be better informed about the performance of different devices so that they are completely aware of the risks and uncertainties of that device. Whereas others said more like the second quote and expressed really skepticism and just that's not going to work. We can't explain to the patients the nuances of different devices, and we can't be taking the time to engage them in decision-making about medical devices. Now, there was probably some confusion around informed consent. So a number of them said, well, yes, we do informed consent with patients, but that did not extend to talking about the performance of the devices, the uncertainty of the risks and outcomes, and it did not extend to conflict of interest where the clinician might have been somehow involved with the company or in the development of the device. And we'll come back to that, the conflict of interest issue. This is a table from the publication, and I won't go through it in great detail. Some of these issues we've kind of already talked about because they influence clinician decision-making in the selection of devices. But in general, the clinicians told us that they really don't engage patients in detailed discussions about the nature of the devices or certainly in decision-making about the devices for a wide variety of reasons. Some of them, might make sense. So in terms, the second bullet point, prognosis, life or death scenario, the patient has come in because they've had a major heart trauma and they need, emergency surgery, then there might be a little time to have a thorough discussion with them or the family about which device is right. But, some of these themes that emerged have implications that certainly warrant further investigation. So, for example, for age, somebody said, they're an old person, so if the device is likely to have a lifespan longer than their lifespan, then why would you bother engaging them in a discussion about it? It's suitable enough for them. We wanted to talk to them about whether and how they report adverse medical device events when they arise. So we asked a few questions about, well, what are the adverse medical device events that arise and what are the implications of those? So they told us that during surgery, there's a variety of adverse events that occur. So it might be that the instructions they find out are incorrect for how to use the device. The device itself may exhibit unexpected behavior. So one cardiovascular surgeon said something about implanting a valve and it didn't take the shape it's supposed to shape and then it popped out, and so then they had to wait for a new device to be brought in. So it could be the device itself, could be the failure of the implanting system. So for a lot of these devices, they have devices that you attach to the device to implant it. So it might be the implanting mechanism. Some devices came with broken or unusable components or misaligned or mismatched components, or even though they specifically chose a device based on size, dimensions that were meant to fit the patient's physiology, for whatever reason, it actually didn't end up fitting properly. After surgery, they talked about a lot of bad physiological responses to various types of devices. This pertains to cardiovascular and orthopedic devices and other device problems that happen, such as unhinging of devices like elbow joints. We asked them, so what are the implications of these bad things when they happen? What's the impact of the outcome? So they talked about things like longer surgery, which results in increased risk of morbidity, mortality, patients having to come in either pre or post-discharge for revision surgery. Serious cardiovascular events could be loss of organs or limbs due to thrombosis or artery blockage or death. And then a lot of the orthopedic implications I've already talked about. And those certainly impact on quality of life and function. Impact on providers. I found that they didn't, maybe because they hadn't really thought about this. What they told me about the impact on them in the hospitals was more limited, but it certainly caused them to reflect on whether they themselves caused the problem or whether it was the device itself. As a result, they might switch products or companies. Certainly causes stress and annoyance when it delays surgeries. In terms of hospital and the health system, they talked about wasting operating room time, nursing time, cost of devices that were unusable, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the effort of identifying patients in whom recall devices were implanted. So this leads me to the study that we published based on our question to them about whether and how they report adverse medical devices when they arise. And this was published in BMJ Quality and Safety fairly recently. Here again, it's a pretty complex table, and I'll kind of work my way around it. If we start with physician beliefs and behavior, there are a lot of interesting nuances here in what they told me. So the vast majority of them did not have a sense of responsibility that they really needed to report. So many of them said things like, well, probably the operating room nurse reports when something goes on, or they didn't feel like when something happened, it was up to them to do something about it. A lot of their underreporting is as a result of their views about what constitutes an adverse medical device event or how it should be addressed. So a number of them talked about the fact that it's just an unexpected or unavoidable part of practice. Some of them talked about the fact that it's only really an adverse event if it occurs within a relatively short period of time. They talked about the fact that they believe that adverse medical device events are less frequent than in the past. So in a sense, they were kind of downplaying it because in their mind, the situation was now better than in the past. They felt that it was only adverse or a concern if it was quite a catastrophic event like this. And they also noted that it really was confounded by multiple factors. So is it really the device? Is it the person using the device? Is it just the patient's physiology? Is it normal wear and tear of a device? In response, so given these views and attitudes about what is an adverse event, generally they would just switch to something else if they could, if there was another comparable device on the market, or if their contract allowed them, the purchasing contract allowed them to choose another device, they might just switch to a different device if they found a particular device was not performing well. Or a lot of them talked about employing workaround solutions. So once they were aware that there was a limitation or an issue with a particular device, they could figure out a way to still use the device, but maybe use a different technique or do something different in their approach to accommodate for the limitations of the device. A lot of why they didn't bother reporting anything is because there's really no system to report to. So they talked about the fact that there's no national, regional, local way to report adverse medical device events. They did talk about things like morbidity, mortality rounds or quality rounds. I forget what they call them now. But that's not really specific to devices. And given that a lot of the time these things aren't even reported, they wouldn't come up in those venues. So there's really no system to capture it. There's really poor documentation of the devices used and outcomes related to those devices in patient records. And their view was that there's really nothing that can be done. If our purchasing contract says we need to use this kind of device and some adverse events are happening with that device, why bother reporting it if we have to keep using this device? They also felt that the industry was not very responsive. So many of them talk about the fact that they reported problems to their device reps, so the company representatives that they deal with, but then they said, well, we don't really know what happens after that. We don't get any reporting back, and we don't know if they report it to the company or what's done at the company level. But they felt like, really, there's no point for them to report problems to the company because it doesn't really change the device manufacturing. So here's some interesting quotes that I'll let you read through. The second quote is interesting because it really speaks to longer-term monitoring. So they might see a patient in follow-up, but only just to make sure they healed from the surgery, and they wouldn't continue to be monitored specific to device problems that might arise as a result of the device. And then the last quote, eventually the manufacturer paid attention and then changed the engineering of the device, but that took probably somewhere between 2 and 3 years. They've invested a huge amount of money in product development, and then they've got a big back inventory. So there's a big cost associated with change, and if the clinicians have figured out that workaround solution so that they can keep using the device, then there's really not any incentive on them to change. Something that arose as a result of doing these interviews was the interaction and the role of industry representatives. So one of our papers that we were able to publish out of this same series of interviews really related to potential for conflict of interest and just really understanding what is the role of these people who come in to talk about and deliver devices. This is a very interesting part of the study. As you can see here, the industry reps held probably 10 different distinct roles, including providing training on the devices, informing and supporting purchasing. Clinicians reported problems of devices to them, so they might help them troubleshoot and figure out workarounds. They certainly provide financial support. And then the interesting one is, the really interesting one is the big oval on the right, the surgical support. So reps are present in the operating room for the vast majority of cases. In large part because many of them have to actually supply or stock the devices. So some clinicians said a lot of hospitals no longer have an inventory of devices. Instead, when the surgery is scheduled, the device rep comes in, or the clinician would choose from a catalog the type of device they need. The rep comes in and actually provides it. But they're actually they have a lot of proprietary knowledge that's absolutely essential for doing the procedure, because only they know how to properly assemble a device that might be comprised of many, many, many parts. And they provide guidance to the nurses, and the clinician said, well, that frees us surgeons to do the surgical job. We don't have to oversee the nurses putting the parts together to get it ready for the patient. And so really, without them there, it would be a challenging thing to implant these devices. So in many ways, they are almost like a member of the operating team. And here are some interesting quotes. And there were some differences of opinion on this. So the first quote is about that essential role of the industry rep in the operating room. The second one is different. He said, I don't like having them in the room. I want the operating room team to learn the equipment and to know how to use it without needing the rep to be there. They recognize that this very, very close relationship with the reps, which they called symbiotic, that it was a tense relationship because there was a possibility for conflict of interest there, but particularly when there's a purchasing contract with a specific company, those reps had to be there. They had to interact with them. They have to be in the operating room. So it's definitely not arm's length relationship. And then the other issue that I also mentioned is that many of them felt they could implicitly trust their rep. They had known them since they were a trainee. They had a very good relationship with their rep. Whereas others acknowledged that, sometimes the rep doesn't give me the information I need. So they needed to be very vigilant, as in the last quote. You're always double checking everything, verifying with your colleagues to make sure that, the device is the best it can be for that patient. So I've presented kind of a quick smattering of a whole bunch of different pieces of information that have a number of interesting implications in terms of what to do next. So do we strengthen pre-market evaluation? Do we generate better evidence upfront before devices are marketed? Do we change the regulatory approval system? Or do we focus our efforts on post-market evaluation? So do we strengthen our ability to monitor and then address adverse medical device events? Essentially, we need data for all of that, and it may be that we need to do something in more than one of these domains. So in order to discuss that, we from CIHR acquired, funding to have a planning or a dissemination meeting, as it's called, and we held a one-day meeting with individuals from all over Canada representing a variety of different roles, as you can see here. 49 different people, but that included patients, and this time it included even VPs and CEOs from industry companies. And we asked them, given all this information from our study, which we presented to them, what should be done? What are the pre- and post-market strategies that we need to optimize medical device use, safety, and optimize outcomes? So they recommended a number of things for policy and practice. As you can see here, we need more money for research and development for health technology assessment. Yay! Fortify regulatory standards based on human factors engineering. They suggested we better describe what data is available in Canada to help us to monitor adverse medical device events. They felt like there should be a plan, not us researchers, but that a committee or a body should be struck in order to generate a plan for a national device registry and reporting system. At the same time, they thought that professional colleges could probably do a better job of skilling, offering continuing education or mentoring to help clinicians become proficient on a wider array of devices. And then develop and implement a model of evidence-based device purchasing. In terms of ongoing research, they suggested that given all these factors, we really need to generate harder evidence of whether these potential problems that we uncovered actually influence outcomes. And so they recommended more research to be able to associate some of these issues with outcomes and costs. They thought that it would be useful to generate criteria or guidance on really how much evidence do you need before a device should be marketed and used. And there is an organization that does that. There's the Ideal organization, which you may be familiar with, maybe more familiar with than I, that generates guidance on what type of evidence is needed at different stages of product or technology development. The Ideal D framework is more specific to surgery. They also suggested that we figure out how to better engage patients in not only decision-making, but in reporting adverse medical device events, given that clinicians may only follow a patient directly after their surgery and make sure they recover from the surgery, but on a longer-term basis, maybe patients themselves can be somehow informed or trained or educated in order to identify when there's problems with their devices. Clinicians and patients, they're currently free to report problems with devices up to the national level, but probably most people don't know that, or they don't know how to do that, and may not be able to recognize when a problem is happening and that should be reported. So, as I said, our study was really very exploratory. It raised a number of different interesting insights into the use of medical devices and reporting of adverse medical device events, and really raises a number of avenues for ongoing research. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about that, or have sort of an interactive discussion about where does this research agenda go from here. I've had only very preliminary discussions about it with Murray. Certainly it's relevant to what THETA does, and there's just probably so many avenues to take this. A lifetime of ongoing research.
I'll just make one comment to get the discussion going. I mean, if you compare how drugs are evaluated to how devices are evaluated, I mean, it's just shockingly different.
Very different, profoundly different.
The level of evidence that's required before drugs get into the is very high. There's a separate HTA purchasing hurdle that most drugs have to surmount. That seems like, from your descriptions, like an amazing study. I think like 5 grants to write just on the basis of this. It's like the Wild West. It seems like 1 in 3 devices get recalled. Beta testing on patients. It's just shocking. The level of evidence that informs people who are making Health Canada regulatory decisions, purchasing decisions, seems like shockingly low. The potential for conflict of interest, it's just it's an amazing, and the last thing is like the potential for using administrative data for following these people up over time is just extraordinary, I would think. It sounds like that's an obvious thing to do, but it hasn't been done to date.
That's right. Yeah, so a lot of very interesting avenues to follow up on in terms of research. After the last meetings that we had, certainly generated a lot of interest among everyone, but, it's not like us as a small research group can push forward with these very high-level, policy types of decisions or initiatives that would need to happen in order to move this forward kind of at either a national level or provincial level.
Well, Harindra is now the VP of Devices at
I'm presenting this at CADIF in April at their annual conference in Halifax. Yeah, it's a breakfast address. So it will be interesting to see what we can do with CADIF, or where CADIF could take some of this. I wonder if Corey came in here. He's a grad student with Dr. David Urbach, who I collaborated with, and I wonder if you just want to make a brief comment on what you're going to be working on for your thesis work.
Hello, everyone. I'm Corey, and Anna is also on my program advisory committee for my master's. What I'm doing is I'm looking in a retrospective sense at the body of evidence that was present prior to recall taking place of both orthopedic and cardiovascular devices. So kind of creating those systematic reviews of what was the quality of the evidence that was generated prior to giving the license to go for these devices to enter the market.
For the recalled devices.
For the recalled devices,
that's
interesting. We have one question from the online participant. So how may your research and findings best find their way to medical schools? Sorry, just got so and clinicians.
So we all know that publishing research, as I've shown here in medical journals, isn't going to do the trick. We tried to, in our study, take a integrated knowledge translation approach. So as you're probably all well aware, when we do research now, you can't just be a little group of researchers doing research. You're more likely to be funded, and your research is more likely to be relevant to end users and be used by end users if you involve them in the research. So we certainly made attempts to do that. As well, we held a meeting many years ago, that was in 2012, that we held our first meeting to involve them in helping us plan our research. And then more recently in last November, not last November, the November before, in 2016, we held a meeting again of clinicians, medical device companies, the professional association that represents medical device companies, they're called MEDEC, policymakers, wide variety of people came to that meeting so that we could share this information with them in order to stimulate, it's easy for us to see what research should be done next, but we really were hoping to stimulate some sort of decisions or action items or some movement at the policy level, at the national level. I'm happy to hear suggestions from others on that answers that question. What else could we as researchers do in order to bring this to the attention of people who maybe we haven't yet connected with? CADIF was certainly aware of our research. Is there someone is there a group or organization that we haven't thought of that we're missing that might be able to move this forward?
Media.
Media.
If you have a few really horrible cases that, because oftentimes just one or two really shocking cases will galvanize public decision making in a way that any number of statistics will not.
And it may be that consumer groups can be who are interested in this can move it forward. There was an interesting comment from one of the patients that came to our meeting in 2016. So they were thrilled to be there. And we had a patient panel where each of them had an opportunity to explain, these are the devices I've had implanted, these have been my experiences with them. They all had some, not great experiences with their devices in terms of complications, etc. But they were also grateful to have access to and to have been given these devices, which for many of them have made them functional and improved their quality of life and made them able to do things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do. But the comment made to me at the end of the meeting, a couple of them thanked me profusely for inviting them to the meeting because I can't remember the exact words and I wish I could, but this woman said, I didn't realize the potential problems associated with us. Like, it opened her eyes to this issue of safety and outcomes and follow-up that she had not at all been aware of. I'm really not articulating it very well, but it just really struck me that she said, we didn't even know that we could do anything about this. So it may be just with some information reaching that group, and a lot of consumer groups can be very proactive in terms of prompting for change, that they may be interested in picking this up. Was there a question here?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I guess I'm just curious in finding out a little bit more about the current role that a regulator, so Health Canada, has in terms of the post-market stage. Are there existing feedback loops back to Health Canada? How does it work in the device role?
Yeah. So at the beginning of the presentation, and I'll try to get this right, I might get some of this wrong because I'm not intimately familiar with all of the regulatory details. So I apologize to Patrick Sanjak, who I think is listening in. I don't get all the details correct. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that there's 4 different classes of devices. I think for class 3 and 4, so the more higher risk, manufacturers have to make an application to Health Canada and have to present some data to show that they have tested that a device is safe and effective, and then they get a license. And it's really the onus on the manufacturers to report to Health Canada if there has been an issue or safety concern with a particular device. Then that is assessed by Health Canada, who then issues an alert or a recall. But a recall can be different levels of recalls. So again, it may not necessarily be a recall where the device is removed from the market. It may just be a warning so that individuals are aware that this device has this limitation. So sort of use it with caution. People can report, so manufacturers are required to report problems to Health Canada. Clinicians, hospitals, patients can report problems to Health Canada, so they do have a mechanism for that on their website. Health Canada also runs, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but a sentinel surveillance network. So I believe it's voluntary, but hospitals from across Canada can volunteer to be part of the sentinel network and monitor for adverse medical device events for specific devices and report it to the sentinel device network. So there is some data collection at that level, but it's not sort of all comprehensive.
Yes, just wondering if you could comment on what's happening internationally in terms of post-marketing surveillance, not just
Right.
Canada, I guess, how organizations and countries work together on FDA.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. It's something that was recommended by the people who came to our meeting, is that if we could get a better sense of what great things are being done elsewhere, then maybe we could borrow from those strategies or solutions. So certainly the FDA has been collecting information for a long time in terms of evidence required in order to have a medical device licensed. If a medical device is like new, it's never been used before, then you need to have a certain amount of evidence. If, however, and this is more often the case, if you generate, let's say, a new and improved version of a knee implant that was initially licensed 20 years ago, and you can show or somehow claim that it's really the same device, and you really don't need to show any evidence that iteration, that version of the device, you don't need to show evidence that that particular version of the device is safe and effective. I'm not sure that I would say that they do more monitoring than we do in Canada, but they certainly have more data collection of adverse medical device events. There's a couple of places that seem to be doing a better job at collecting the data, so that would be Australia and I think the Netherlands. We haven't looked in great detail at the information that they do collect, but it's available online. The Australian one is anyway. You can collect quite detailed information online in the Australian database. And I know that there's a big program, like a portfolio in England for medical devices, but I'm not sure how far along they are. It's certainly something that warrants investigation and monitoring, though, to keep on top of what's happening elsewhere that we could learn from. Yes?
You say these companies are presenting evidence. Like, what is the kind of threshold for acceptable evidence? Because obviously, like, evidence could just be, I got a couple of patients, I gave them a knee, and I followed them up for a couple of days, and they seemed fine. Or are we talking like they had to have comparative studies? Like, what's the threshold? Because for drugs, it's insane. Anything other than a randomized controlled trial isn't going to apply.
So for Health Canada, for instance, I'm not really sure what for Class 3, Class 4 devices, so let's say hips, knees, or cardiovascular devices, I'm not sure exactly how much evidence they need in order to, or what type of evidence, how many patients, what kind of follow-up. I'm not really sure what their criteria are for having, getting a device licensed. But as this is what prompted us to do the study that I showed with the knee implants, which showed that a lot of studies have less than 100 patients, less than 2 years follow-up. They're not comparative studies at all. They're single cohorts. And that was that was the average, less than 100 patients. So many of them have a lot less. Some have many more, but it's really quite variable from device to device, and certainly not nearly as robust as what is expected for drugs. Corey?
I'll just add a comment to that. From one of the main papers that was cited in that eye-opening article from the 2005-2015 was a paper by Maisel et al. In 2004. And in that paper, they speak mainly about the FDA, but they discuss that one of the burdens of medical devices is you want to try to get it out there as soon as possible to help that patient. So inherent within devices is what's known as the least burdensome approach. So the minimal amount of evidence you can provide, but that it can still be of some benefit, and that's all that's required. Which leads to head turning and lots of difficulty.
Why would that not be the same for drugs? Yeah, I mean, I changed the molecule a little bit, and I thought, man, I got to get this to the patients right away. Like, just think of the benefit that it could accrue. Like, why should we wait? What's the difference?
In fact, it's almost these permanently implanted devices are there in the patient forever. You can stop taking the drug and take something else once you're good.
Right.
Bad knee replacement, and it's in.
Is there another question?
Yes, there's another question online. It's from Mandeep Singh at UHM. Many thanks for the excellent presentation. In addition to therapeutic devices, There has also been an advent of medical devices being used for diagnosis, example sleep apnea. Are you aware of any studies framework used to evaluate patient-provider preferences in the diagnostic setting? And your thoughts on the importance of conducting a similar body of research in this setting?
So in our research, we just focused on the hips and knees because they're so prevalent and of moderate risk, and then the cardiovascular devices because they're high risk. We didn't look at we didn't look at other devices, but it would certainly be warranted because, and I might flip back here. This will help me make the point better. I'm flipping back to the 10-year study. So as you can see, there were recalls of different seriousness across all classes of devices. So that would include diagnostic devices. And in fact, some of the, in that paper, if you have a look at that paper, there's actually a list of the types of devices in the 4 classes that were recalled. So that will give you a good sense of some of the other types of devices that also probably warrant a similar investigation. And even some of the class 1 devices. So these are things like bed lifts caused the most serious of adverse events. Some of the others were things like diabetes test kits. One of those malfunction. So things that seem relatively benign but can have quite serious consequences.
Well, there's also the whole issue of just, if you're looking at diagnostic testing, things which don't perform very well. So they may hurt anybody, but they may miss a diagnosis or they may overdiagnose. And that's not seen as an adverse event, but it's going to have an effect on someone's health.
That's right. Another one that is notable is software that comes with some of the diagnostic tests. The software is what gets recalled because there's some sort of problem with the software. So there's a wide array of types of technologies that aren't necessarily implantable devices.
We have another question. This one's from Mary Susan McDonald. Thank you for excellent presentation. Would it be feasible for your findings to be included in an engaging patient story? Such a story could be published in professional publications or news media. Is there an appropriate advocacy journalist group such as Eileen Rothman or CBC Marketplace that might be interested in partnering on this issue?
It is. It's a very good idea, and something that probably we should pursue. And there must be some support for that at UHN. I myself am not hooked into the media, but there's likely some sort of public relations people at UHN that would best know how to move forward on that. Yeah.
So it's 2:05. Thank you for an amazing talk. Galvanized a lot of interest. We hope to do lots more research and write lots more grants in this area.
Hopefully, yes. Thank you.
Thanks again.